So Emily, what's on your radar?
You know, the culture war, as usual. Mallory McMorrow wowed James Carville himself this week, reportedly nudging some establishment Democrats towards a new playbook in that culture war. After Glenn Youngkin bested Terry McAuliffe in a blue state last fall, it's really no secret that Democrats have been flailing to land on a strategy that defends the substance of their positions, particularly on education. So to most of the country, when all the media spin is stripped away, those positions are not pretty. Many of the people I talked to when I was reporting out in Loudoun County, Virginia, before that election were minorities. Some of them were recent immigrants. Matt Taibbi's reporting in Northern Virginia found something similar. Nevertheless, in a matter of hours after Glenn Youngkin won, the establishment media's explanation for that upset, of course, just became racism. So enter McMorrow, a state senator in Michigan. McMorrow was recently invoked in a Republicans fundraising email that said, quote, "These are the people we are up against, progressive social media trolls like Senator Mallory McMorrow, who are, it also identified her as D Snowflake, who are outraged they can't teach, can't groom, and sexualize kindergartners, or that 8-year-olds are responsible for slavery." So here's how McMorrow responded.
I didn't expect to wake up yesterday to the news that the senator from the 22nd district had overnight accused me by name of grooming and sexualizing children in an email fundraising for herself. So I sat on it for a while wondering, why me? And then I realized, because I am the biggest threat to your hollow, hateful scheme.
This delighted Don Lemon, Hillary Clinton, and the cast of Morning Joe, of course. James Carville himself said, quote, "It could be or should be used as an instructional video." Over at the Washington Post, Greg Sargent wrote, quote, "You'll note that McMorrow didn't sound defensive or offer mealy-mouthed, hair-splitting fact checks. She didn't capitulate to the Republican framing on these matters for a second. Instead, McMorrow laid bare her deepest convictions and explained how they led her to her positions on gay and trans rights and why basic human decency demands them. Importantly, she made this about what Republicans are doing." Now, from a purely strategic political standpoint, Sargent was totally right to laud McMorrow for putting Republicans on defense and avoiding the hair splitting. But on the substance, Democrats would be foolish to think McMorrow's approach in that video is the solution to their problem. Politico's Playbook said Democratic strategist Ben LaBolt praised McMorrow, just like Carville, quote, "for leaning into her personal story and framing these issues around defending basic human rights and a more inclusive society." LaBolt, according to Politico, also argued that a vast majority of Americans support abortion rights and LGBTQ rights, which is why for a long time many mainstream Republicans stopped making their own stances on those issues, which sometimes differed from society's prevailing views, central to their campaigns. But now, red state after red state has enacted laws restricting abortion in anticipation of a major ruling on Roe v. Wade, banning transgender children from school sports, and so on, issues that LaBolt thinks Democrats can win on if they start talking more like McMorrow. Okay, those 2 points are not at all connected. Attacking Republicans on abortion won't change voters' minds about curricula and sex and race, nor will trans sports be a winning issue for Democrats between the coasts either. Here's something interesting. A Detroit Free Press article on the matter sought to define grooming for its audience. Here's what the article said. A groomer is someone who establishes a connection with a child in an effort to ultimately exploit or physically abuse that child. Here's another definition of a groomer. People who are working to desensitize the sexualization of children, creating comfort in the child for sexual issues, and working to create a rift between the child and the parent so the children's protective system is no longer available to them. Now, both definitions are pretty much exactly how I've always defined that term in my own mind, but the second one is from the Republican behind the fundraising email that attacked McMorrow. So if you consider, say, the normalization of puberty blockers, physical abuse, which I do, then the connections to some teachers seem openly to be making with these dysphoric children look a lot more similar to the consensus definition that we've shared of that term. But this is precisely what's at the heart of our current culture war, as we've discussed many, many times on the show. We no longer share a consensus on sex and gender or abuse or racism or bigotry or even violence. Our consensus definition of what grooming is just a downstream casualty of that much, much bigger problem. So there's just no question Republicans will cross the line and overplay their hands on some of these issues. Right when Ron DeSantis' so-called Don't Say Gay bill came out on this show, I immediately said that it seemed too vague. Party politics are mind-numbingly stupid. That's how all of this works. They always have been. I've said this since the day that bill came out, as I just mentioned. But if Democrats think they can talk their way out of this problem, they're sorely mistaken and immoral to boot. The Libs of TikTok controversy that roiled the very online bubble this week was so dumb and so exhausting. But Matt Taibbi, again, made the most salient point on his Substack. Now, in her expose of the anonymous Twitter account, America's sweetheart Taylor Lorenz left out pretty much all of the context from the videos that account posts. Real journalists, honest journalists, even ones with opinions, would have added that context and quoted the videos extensively, knowing it makes the story both more fair and more compelling. All the layers of editorial oversight at the Post let Lorenz get away with this too. Here's what Matt wrote about one example from the Taylor Lorenz piece. Lorenz is doing the Post readers a disservice by implying that Oklahoma parents are going after a poor teacher for telling shunned LGBTQ kids he's proud of them. The line that actually triggered the controversy was, if your parents don't accept you for who you are, F them, I'm your parents now. Taibbi continues, ask any parent from either party how they'd react to hearing their child's middle school teacher say that. All Lorenz said in her story was that the teacher, quote, posted a video telling LGBTQ kids shunned by their parents that Rin was proud of them and loved them. Okay, so the difference between what she wrote and what actually happened in that video is massive, and framing this as human rights or children's rights or LGBTQ rights is A, completely inaccurate, and B, doesn't help Democrats solve the problem of the substance in that video. And I'll concede readily this is almost impossible to quantify, but curricula used en masse is premised on a racist concept of anti-racism and a sexist concept of anti-sexism. That's a very real problem. And if we can agree on those traditional definitions in the first place, racism and sexism involve discrimination based on a belief a race or sex is inherently inferior. We know it's used everywhere in the curricula because the groups that create it brag about it. When Terry McAuliffe dismissed curriculum concerns about CRT as a dog whistle, it took no time at all for documents to prove it was literally implemented in Virginia public schools. His own Department of Education had explicitly called on all schools to embrace it back in 2015. Now, back in March, the neoliberal Twitter account wondered why Republicans were prioritizing, quote, anti-gay, anti-LGBT bills. I wanted to somehow respond by quantifying how prolific these lesson plans are, because again, it's hard to quantify. And immediately, when I got on a search engine, found major public school districts around the country and major organizations like the NEA, the ADL, and GLSN bragging about their promotion of radical teachings on sex and gender starting in kindergarten. So I could easily pull 50 videos from Libs of TikTok of teachers boasting about unreasonable and inappropriate ideological conduct, and you wouldn't see it in the Washington Post, but that would be only a fraction of what's actually out there. And these are just what's being put publicly online. We actually compiled a list of these back in July over at The Federalist. The point is that this is a very real problem in communities around the country. I've spoken to parents of daughters who were deeply harmed by the school's messaging on sex. It's not abstract, it's happening, the taxpayers are funding it, and it's extremely sad. So McMorrow can muster righteous indignation against overreaching Republicans all she wants, and in this case, the Republican did admit to sort of overreaching. But if Democrats don't have a defense or rebuke for the extremism that's trickled from academia into K-12 school curricula and corporate HR trainings, voters are not going to be swayed at all, and this is bigger than politics or abstract intellectual debates in the DC bubble. This is tearing communities and schools and families apart. It's immediately shaping the next generation of voters and workers and journalists and politicians. It's serious, and Democrats will need to address it with more than deflections and platitudes, no matter how nice they sound. Randy, this video kind of reminds me of Randy Bryce. Must have been like the summer of 2017 or 2018. He was going to run against Paul Ryan, not far where I'm from in Wisconsin, and the sort of Beltway establishment Democrats fawned over him. He was for Medicare for all. He's fairly progressive. I saw him speak at Netroots Nation. He was very, very progressive for that area of Wisconsin. And the idea was that going more progressive is going to be more helpful. And I kind of agree with that in a certain sense, that like if you're honest about your positions and you want to actually help people, you're going to do better than some like establishment person who is being mealy-mouthed and all of that. But the Beltway just like salivated over him. His candidacy went nowhere. They thought this was their solution to the Trump era. I kind of think it's something similar here, that Democrats are deluding themselves into thinking they can just have nice speeches that, you know, deflect, and they've solved the CRT problem. They've solved the, you know, the queer theory and, you know, grade 7 problem.
Well, both parties have versions of this where they feel like they're in retreat, and then somebody stands up for them in a vocal way and rallies everybody. And I think that case is a good example. Mallory McMorrow, yeah. McMorrow is a good example because she also represents something that they feel that they don't feel as confident in how they're doing in Michigan, and particularly among a lot of white voters in Michigan and among parents. You know, they're reeling from a lot of these losses, and so here's a Michigan woman and a parent who's giving a strong, unapologetic, you know, deep defense of her position and going on offense against Republicans. And you know, you saw in 2012, Elizabeth Warren gave this viral "You built that with help" speech.
Yes,
if you remember that one, which similarly kind of took the Republicans, "You didn't build that," and it took all of this Tea Party energy and shot it back at them. You saw the same thing with Howard Dean. Howard Dean in 2003 was the only Democrat willing to stand up to George Bush, you know, and call him a fraud and a liar and a warmonger.
Yes, yeah.
And as a result, got a massive amount of support. And what all of these things have in common is that, you know, Democrats were reeling at all of these different moments, and they finally felt something that they could, you know, that was going to lead them out of the wilderness. And in a lot of those, in most of those cases, they generally did follow that kind of attitude. Right. It eventually took a while, but it did help them find their footing and find their voice. And so I think you're going to see a similar thing with this. But Democrats are going to have to get right, they're going to have to get a little bit more honest about what's going on specifically. For instance, it probably would have been better for the Washington Post to just quote the video. It's way more interesting. Right, but I do think that saying that any teacher forming a connection with a student can be grooming, it extends the definition to it.
Agree.
Far too wildly.
I completely agree.
Teachers should have connections with students. Yeah. That's important. Everybody growing up remembers the connections that they formed with their favorite teachers, and it becomes a touchstone for your life. It's something that you remember, and in tough times, go back and think about. So that's important, and for us to try to borderline criminalize that, and actually practically in Florida criminalize it, depending on how judges interpret the conversations that are had between students and teachers, really disrupts the ability of students to have meaningful educational interactions with their teachers. So so I think Democrats are hoping that their own overreach in some of these issues is going to be papered over by Republicans' inability to control their own worst impulses, because I haven't done an exhaustive run through of the Libs of TikTok account, but there did seem to be some stuff that goes far beyond just parodying Libs of TikTok and into genuine homophobia.
Oh, on Libs of TikTok?
Yeah.
I don't know that I've seen any of that, but this is another interesting debate, and I've been telling people on the right they need to buckle up, because this is coming to a conversation. This is inevitably going to land back at a conversation on gay marriage, and a lot of people on the right don't see that coming. But when you are saying there's a difference in, let's say, kisses in Disney movies between straight parents and gay parents, that's where you're ending back up, and so they're going to want to buckle up to have that conversation, because inevitably we're going back in that direction. So I think McMorrow is better than what Democrats Democrats have been doing on some of this, but not confronting it head on is not going to be good for Democrats. They need an answer to this. They need to, cut back on the actual excesses, just as Republicans do. Cut back on the actual excesses, confront the problem. It's not good for their party not to do that, and it's not good for the country for them not to do that either.
And what about the attack on Disney? Like, I feel like that might be their, most visible overreach at this point, like boycotting Disney. Like, I was talking to a friend last night because we're unfortunately planning a trip for next year to Disney. Put it off as long as we possibly can. And we're both joking about like the groomers at Disney, and like it's just absurd. Like the idea that like Disney is like grooming, and so like it feels like that's not something that like normal people are even going to engage with the right on. It's like stop with the Disney stuff.
I don't know. The videos that leaked of Disney executives saying, for instance, that they had their not-so-secret gay agenda that they were
intentionally... I saw that one.
But that's why this is going to go back to... that's inevitably going to go back to those questions. Why is it different? And that's the culture war here is we're treading into different territory. And I don't think either side is particularly prepared for it.
That's right. Hey, if they shut down Disney, I don't have to go.
That's right. They're not shutting down Disney. That's not happening. And they're certainly not moving it to Colorado, as Jared Polis tried to tempt them.
That'd be nice, actually. I'd rather go to Disney in Colorado than in the 105-degree Orlando.
They might lose some business in the winter.
That's true.
Well, we'll have Tom Graham on the show to talk about deepfakes right after this.